and welcome to Storytime. Wasn't that last chapter so exciting? Couldn't wait to read to the end of that chapter. So now we're going to start chapter 11. Does Marie mine? Alex walked through Port Talon, past the Fisherman's Arms public house and up to the cobbled streets towards the library. It was the middle of the afternoon, but the village seemed to be asleep. The boats bobbing in the arbour, the streets and pavements empty. A few seagulls wheezed lazily over the rooftops, uttering their usual mournful cries. The air smelled of salt and dead fish. The library was red bricked, Victorian, sitting self-importantly at the top of a hill. Alex pushed open the heavy swing door and went into a room with a tiled chessboard floor and about 50 shelves fanning out from the central reception area. 6 or 7 people were sitting at tables working. A man in a thickly knitted jersey was reading Fisherman's Week. Alex went over to the reception desk. There was the inevitable sign, "Silence, please." Beneath it, a smiling, round-faced woman sat reading Crime and Punishment. "Can I help you?" Despite the sign, she had such a loud voice that everyone looked up when she spoke. Yes. Alex had come here because of a chance remark made by Harold Sale. He'd been talking about Ian Ryder. Spent half his time in the village, in the port, the post office, the library. Alex had already seen the post office, another old-fashioned building near the port. He didn't think he'd learn anything there. But the library. Maybe Ryder had come looking for information. Maybe the librarian would remember him. "I had a friend staying in the village," Alex said. "I was wondering if he came here. His name's Ian Ryder." "Ryder? With an I or a Y? I don't think we have any Ryders at all." The woman tapped a few keys on her computer, then shook her head. "No." "He was staying at Sale Enterprises," Alex said. "He was about 40, thin, fair hair, drove a BMW. "Oh, yes," the librarian smiled. "He did come here a couple of times. Very nice man. Very polite. I knew he didn't come from around here. He was looking for a book." "Do you remember which book?" "Of course I do. I can't always remember faces, but I never forget a book. He was interested in viruses." "Viruses?" "Yes, that's what I said. He wanted some information." "A computer virus. This might change everything. A computer virus is a perfect act of sabotage, invisible and instantaneous. A single blip written into software and every single piece of information in the Stormbreaker software would be destroyed at any time." But Harold Sale couldn't possibly want to damage his own creation. That would make no sense at all. So maybe Alex had been wrong about him from the start. Maybe Sale had no idea of what was really going on. "I'm afraid I couldn't help him," the librarian continued. "This is only a small library and our grant's been cut for the 3rd year running." She sighed. "Anyway, he said he'd get some books sent down from London. He told me he had a box at the post office." That made sense. Ian Ryder wouldn't have wanted information sent to Sale Enterprises where it could be intercepted. "Was that the last time you saw him?" Alex asked. "No, he came back a week later. He must have got what he wanted because this time he wasn't looking for books about viruses. He was interested in local affairs." "Sort of local affairs?" "Cornish local history. Shelf CL." She pointed. "He spent an afternoon looking in one of the books and then he left." He hasn't been back since then, which is a shame. I was rather hoping he'd join the library. It would be nice to have a new member. Local history wasn't going to help him. Alex thanked the librarian and made for the door. His hand was just reaching for the handle when he remembered CL 475/19. He reached into his pocket and took out the square of paper he had found in his bedroom. Sure enough, the letters were the same, CL. They weren't showing a grid reference. CL was the label on a book. Alex went over to the shelf the librarian had shown him. Books grow old faster when they're not being read, and the ones gathered here were long past retirement, leaning tiredly against one another for support. CL 475/19, the number was printed on the spine, was called Dosmery, the story of Cornwall's oldest mine. Carried it over to a table and opened it and quickly skimmed through it, wondering why a history of Cornish tin would have been of interest to Ian Ryder. The story it told was a familiar one. The mine had been owned by the Dosmery family for 11 generations. In the 19th century, there had been 400 tin mines in Cornwall, but by early 19th century, there were only 3. Dosmery was still one of them. The price of tin had collapsed, and the mine itself was almost exhausted, but there was no other work in the area, and the family had continued to run it, even though the mine was quickly exhausting them. In 1991, Sir Robert Dosmery, the last owner, had quietly slipped away and blown his brains out. He was buried in the local churchyard in a coffin made, it was said, of tin. His children had closed down the mine, selling the land above it to Sale Enterprises. The mine itself was sealed off, with several of the tunnels now underwater. The book contained a number of old black and white photographs, pit ponies and old-fashioned lanterns, groups of figures standing with axes and lunchboxes. Now all of them would be under the ground themselves. Flicking through the pages, Alex came to a map showing the layout of the tunnels at the time when the mine was closed. It was hard to be sure of the scale, but there was a labyrinth of shafts, tunnels and railway lines running for miles underground. Go down into the utter blackness of the underground and you'd be lost instantly. Ian Ryder made his way into Dosmery. If so, what had he found? Alex remembered the corridor at the foot of the metal staircase, the dark brown, unfinished walls, and the light bulbs hanging on their wires had reminded him of something. And suddenly he knew what it was. The corridor must be nothing more than one of the tunnels from the old mine. Suppose Ian Ryder had also gone down the staircase. Like Alex, he had been confronted with the locked metal door and had been determined to find his way past it. But he had recognised the corridor for what it was, and that was why he had come back to the library. He had found a book on the Dosmery mine. This book. The map had shown him a way to the other side of the door. And he made a note of it. Alex took out the diagram that Ian Ryder had drawn and laid it on the page on top of the printed map. Holding the 2 sheets together, he held them up to the light. This is what he saw. I'll show you the map just here. So this is what he saw. Alex remembered the corridor at the foot of the metal staircase. The lines that Ryder had drawn on the sheet fitted exactly over the shafts and tunnels of the mine, showing the way through. Alex was certain of it. If he could find the entrance to Dosmery, he could follow the map through to the other side of the metal door. 10 minutes later, he left the library with a photocopy of the page. He went down to the harbour and found one of those maritime stores that seemed to sell anything and everything. Here he bought himself a powerful torch, a jersey, a length of rope, and a box of chalk. Then he climbed back into the hills. Back on the quad, Alex raced across the cliff tops, the sun already sinking in the west. Ahead of him he could see the single chimney and crumbling tower he had hoped would mark the entrance to the Kernewick shaft, which took its name from the ancient language of Cornwall. According to the map, this is where he should begin. At least the quad had made his life easier. It would have been taken him about an hour to have reached here on foot. He was running out of time, and he knew it. Already the storm breakers would have begun leaving the plant, and in less than 24 hours, the Prime Minister would be activating them. If the software really had been bugged with some sort of virus, what would happen? Some sort of humiliation for both Sale and the British government? Or worse? Now, how did a computer bug tie in with what he had seen the night before? Whatever the submarine had been delivering at the jetty, it hadn't been computer software. The silver boxes had been too large, and you don't shoot a man for dropping a diskette. Excuse me. Alex parked the quad next to the tower and went in through the arched doorway. At first he thought he must have made some sort of mistake. The building looked more like a ruined church than the entrance to a mine. Other people had been here before him. There were a few crumpled beer cans and old crisp packets on the floor, and the usual graffiti on the walls. JH was here. Nick loves Cass. Visitors leave the worst parts of themselves behind in fluorescent paint. His foot came down on something that clanged, and he saw that he was standing on a metal trapdoor set in the concrete floor. Grass and weeds were sprouting round the edges, but putting his hand against the crack, could feel a draft from air rising from below. This must be the entrance to the shaft. The trap door was bolted down with a heavy padlock, several centimetres thick. Alex swore under his breath. He had left the zit cream back in his room. The cream would have eaten through the bolt in seconds, but he didn't have time to go back to Sale Enterprises to get it. He knelt down and shut the padlock with frustration. To his surprise, it swung open in his hand. Somebody had been here before him. Ian Ryder? It had to be. He must have managed to unlock it and hadn't fully closed it again so that it would be ready when he came back. Alex pulled the padlock out and grabbed hold of the trapdoor. It took all of his strength to pull it up, and as he did so, a blast of cold air hit him in the face. The trapdoor clanged back, and he found himself looking into a black hole that stretched further than the daylight could reach. Alex shone his torch into the hole. The beam went on for about 50 metres. The shaft went further. He found a pebble and dropped it in. It was at least 10 seconds passed before the pebble rattled against something far below. A rusty ladder ran down the side of the shaft. Alex checked that the quad was out of sight, then looped the rope over his shoulder and shoved the torch into his belt. He didn't enjoy climbing into the hole. The metal rungs were ice cold against his hands, and his shoulders were barely sunk beneath the level of the ground before the light was blotted out, and he felt himself being sucked into the darkness, so total that he couldn't even be sure he had eyes. He just had to feel his way, a hand, then a foot, descending further, and yet ever further, until at last his heels struck the ground, and he knew he'd reached the bottom of Kernowick shaft. He looked up. He could just make out the entrance he had climbed through, small, round, as distant as the moon. Breathing heavily, trying to fight off the sense of claustrophobia, he pulled out the torch and flicked it on. The beam leapt out of his hand, pointing the way ahead and throwing pure white light onto his immediate surroundings. Alex was at the start of a long tunnel, the uneven walls and ceiling held back by wooden beams. The floor was already damp, and a sheen of salt water hung in the air. It was cold in the mine. He had known it would be, and before he moved, he pulled on the jersey he had bought, then chalked a large X on the wall. That had been a good idea too. Whatever happened down here, he wanted to be sure he could find the way back. At last he was ready. He took 2 steps forward, away from the vertical shaft and into the start of the tunnel, and immediately felt the weight of the solid rock soil and remaining streaks of tin bearing down on him. It was horrible here. It really was like being buried alive, and it took all his strength to force himself on. After about 50 paces, he came to a second tunnel, branching off to the left. He took out the photocopied map and examined it in the torchlight. According to Ian's rider, this is where he had to turn off. He swung the torch round and followed the tunnel, which slanted downwards, taking him deeper and deeper into the earth. There was absolutely no sound in the mine, apart from his own rasping breath, the crunch of his footsteps, and the quickening thud of his heart. It was as if the blackness was wiping out sound as well as vision. Alex opened his mouth and called out, just to hear something, but his voice sounded small and only reminded him of the huge weight above his head. The tunnel was in bad repair. Some of the beams had snapped and had fallen in, and as he passed, a trickle of gravel hit his neck and shoulders, reminding him that the Dosmary mine had been kept locked for a reason. It was a hellish place. It could collapse at any time. As took him ever deeper, he could feel the pressure pounding in his ears, and the darkness seemed even thicker and more oppressive. He came to a tangle of iron and wire, some sort of machine long ago buried and forgotten. He climbed over it too quickly, cutting his leg on a piece of jagged metal. He stood still for a few seconds, forcing himself to slow down. He knew he couldn't panic. If you panic, you'll get lost. Think what you're doing. Be careful. One step at a time. Okay, okay. He whispered the words to reassure himself, and then continued forward. Now he emerged into a sort of wide circular chamber, formed by the meeting of 6 different tunnels, all coming together in a star shape. The widest of these slanted in from the left, with the remains of the railway track. He swung the torch and picked out a couple of wooden wagons, which must have been used to carry equipment down or tin back up to the surface. Checking the maps, he was tempted to follow the railway, which seemed to offer a shortcut across the route that Ian Ryder had drawn. But he decided against it. His uncle had turned the corner and gone back on himself. There had to be a reason. Alex made another 2 chalk crosses, one for the tunnel he had left, another for the one he was entering. He went on. This new tunnel quickly became lower and narrower, until Alex couldn't walk unless he crouched. The floor was very wet here, with pools of water reaching his ankles. He remembered how near he was to the sea, and that brought another unpleasant thought. What time was high tide? And when the water rose, what would happen inside the mine? Alex suddenly had a vision of himself trapped in the blackness with the water rising up to his chest, his neck, over his face. He stopped and forced himself to think of something else. Down here, on his own, far beneath the surface of the earth, he couldn't make an enemy of his imagination. The tunnel curved, then joined a second railway line, this one bent and broken, covered here and there in rubble, which must have fallen from above. But the metal tracks made it easier to move forward, picking up and reflecting the torch. Alex followed them all the way to a junction with the main railway. It had taken him 30 minutes, and he was almost back to where he had started. But, shining the torch around him, he saw why Ian Ryder had sent him the long way round. There had been a tunnel collapse, about 30 metres up the line. The main railway was blocked. He crossed the tracks, still following the maps, and stopped. He looked at the paper, then again at the way ahead. It was impossible. And yet there was no mistake. It had come to a small round tunnel dipping steeply down. After 10 minutes, the tunnel simply stopped. What looked like a sheet of metal barring the way. Alex picked up a stone and threw it. There was a splash. Now he understood. The tunnel was completely submerged in water, as black as ink. The water had risen up to the ceiling of the tunnel, so that, even assuming he could swim in temperatures that must be close to zero, he would be unable to breathe. After all his hard work, after all the time he had spent underground, there was no way forward. Alex turned. He was about to leave, but even as he swung the torch round, the beam picked up something lying in a heap on the ground. He went over to it and leaned down. It was a diver's dry suit. It looked brand new. Alex walked to the water's edge and examined it with a torch. This time he saw something else. A rope had been tied to a rock. It slanted diagonally into the water and disappeared. Alex knew what it meant. Ian Ryder had swum through the submerged tunnel. He had worn a dry suit and had managed to fix a rope to guide him through. Obviously, he planned to come back. That was why he had left the padlock open. It seemed that once again, Alex had been helped by the dead man. The question was, did he have the nerve to go on? He picked up the dry suit. It was too big for him, although it would probably keep out the worst of the chill. But the cold wasn't the only problem. The tunnel might run for 10 metres. It might run for 100. How could he be sure that Ian Ryder hadn't used scuba equipment to swim through? Alex went down there into the water and ran out of breath halfway. He would drown, pinned underneath a rock in the freezing blackness. He couldn't imagine a worse way to die. But he had come so far, and according to the map, he was nearly there. Alex swore this was not fun. At the moment, he wished he had never heard of Alan Blunt, Sail Enterprises, or the Stormbreaker. But he couldn't go back. If his uncle had done it, so could he. Gritting his teeth, he pulled on the dry suit. It was cold, clammy and uncomfortable. He zipped it up. He hadn't taken off his ordinary clothes, and perhaps that helped. The suit was loose in places, but he was sure it would keep the water out. Moving quickly now, Afraid that if he hesitated, he would change his mind, Alex approached the water's edge. He reached out and took the rope in one hand. It would be faster swimming with both hands, but he didn't dare risk it. Getting lost in the underwater tunnel would be as bad as running out of air. The result would be exactly the same. He had to keep hold of the rope to allow it to guide him through. Alex took several deep breaths, hyperventilating and oxygenating his blood, knowing it would give him a few precious extra seconds. Then he plunged in. The cold was ferocious, a hammer blow that nearly forced the air out of his lungs. The water pounded at his head, swirling round his nose and his eyes. His fingers were instantly numb. His whole system felt the shock, but the dry suit was sealing in at least some of his body warmth. Clinging to the rope, he kicked forward. He had committed himself. There could be no going back. Pull, kick, pull, kick. Alex had been underwater for less than a minute, but already his lungs were feeling the strain. The roof of the tunnel was scraping his shoulders, and he was afraid that it would tear through the dry suit and gouge his skin as well. But he didn't dare slow down. The freezing cold was sucking the strength out of him. Pull and kick, pull and kick. How long had he been under? 90 seconds? 100? His eyes were shut tight, but if he opened them, there would be no difference. He was in black, swirling, freezing version of hell, and his breath was running out. He pulled himself forward along the rope, burning the skin off the palms of his hands. He must have been swimming for almost 2 minutes. It felt closer to 10. He had to open his mouth and breathe, even if it was water that would rush into his throat. A silent scream exploded inside him. Pull, kick, pull, kick. And then the rope tilted upwards, and he felt his shoulders come clear, and his mouth was wrenched open in a great gasp as he breathed air and knew he had made it. Perhaps with only seconds to spare. But made it to where? Alex couldn't see anything. He was floating in utter darkness, unable to see even where the water ended. He had left the torch on the other side, but he knew that even if he wanted to, he didn't have the strength to go back. He had to follow. He had followed the trail left by a dead man. It was only now that he realised it might lead only to the grave. I wonder what's going to happen next. I can't wait to hear Miss Francois read the next chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Looking forward to the next instalment. See you soon.